Now, the aspect of career exploration that is not harder, but it requires a little bit more time than sort of sitting down and sort of reflecting on these things is sort of getting some experience with some of the paths that you might be exploring, because you might discover a thing, a path, a role, an organization, and you might say to yourself, well, how will I know if it's something I want to do? I understand that I have the skills, I'm interested in it, but how will I know if this is something that I can really find valuable or that I would sort of fit into in terms of a professional identity? As a PhD student or as a postdoc, it's going to be hard, obviously, to have internships in places. So the experiences that you need to find then are different from internships. You have to sort of find your own types of experiences to get a sense of whether that is going to be effective or not. So in order to sort of dip your toe into these kind of career fields, you have to be a little bit creative. And I'm going to share one platform here that allows you to do that. But even multiple conversations with people in the role that you may be interested in gives you some level of experience, right? If you are asking questions about what it feels like to work there, or what is done, or what skills are used, over time, you will gain very sort of deep knowledge of what that role is going to be. So even if you don't have the time or the ability to sort of dip your toes in any of these fields, having lots of conversations with people is always a great way of doing that. So the platform that I'm going to talk about today is the InterSECT Job Simulations platform. Again, this is a free, Imagine PhD is a free platform for everyone to use. InterSECT Job Simulations is a free platform for everyone to use. Again, developed with the idea that PhDs and postdocs are looking for opportunities to say, well, what does it look like or what does it feel like? And so this platform follows this idea that exploration where it's experiential gives you better perspective. Learning about things is great. Doing some of those things gives you another layer of information that you can then leverage to say, is this going to be helpful for me? So, once you identify your interests, can you see them in action? And does that feel good to use those skills or that knowledge in that action? And so what you can do on this platform is you can look at a range of different simulations from different fields. And many of these fields echo, so there's humanities ones, there's science ones, there's social sciences ones, so you can look at different categories, but many of these fields echo the job families that Alison was just talking about in Imagine PhD in terms of things that are out there. So including faculty, including diplomacy and things like that. So each of these is an example that was developed in conversation with someone who works in those fields, and they created a representation of what they may do as part of their role. Not necessarily day in, day out, but one example of a thing that they do in their role that illustrates the types of skills and knowledge areas that are going to be valuable. So if we were to pick policy and advocacy as a sort of a job family, there are three simulations that you can leverage here. And we're going to look at this composing a fact sheet sort of one as an example. This is sort of the background to what you're trying to do here. This is the exercise simulation. And you can see that in this case, it gives you some background information about what the nature of that role is. What is it that you're doing in a policy role? And then it goes into the example of the specific simulation. So in this case, an amendment to cut funding for the NEH. You are trying to present information to a representative to give them knowledge of the issue, the stakeholders, anything that might be helpful to them as they are advocating for a position. So you're creating this document that's going to be informative, but it's based on a lot of research and based on you understanding the sort of the concepts around that. So this is the setup to the exercise or the simulation. The deliverable, what you are going to be working on if you want to do this simulation would be, a one-page document of key talking points relevant to not only the issue, but the audience that you're going to be giving this to, perhaps with some visualizations as well. The main challenge with the InterSECT platform is that it's all self-guided, right? You have to look at this and you say, do I want to do this? Do I want to spend some time doing this? But they are good illustrations if you have the interest in this area to start doing this. And we'll talk about right at the end of this what you can do having done the exercise. So it's not just time invested and you're like, well, now what? There is a sort of an outcome to this that is part of the career exploration process. These are some of the broader tasks and responsibilities that are associated with this job family or this particular role, just to give you a particular insight into the range of skills and knowledge that might be touched on. You can see SMART goals talked about at the bottom here. So again, as they think about this, they want you to reflect on that. And there's a self-reflection sheet, which, as we talked about, is a key part of career exploration. This is a higher education simulation, and it's career services related, so that's why I chose it. It's talking about what someone in career services working with graduate students and postdocs might be doing. So it gives you a background. Now, you can come and see us at Career Services and we'll tell you exactly what that looks like. But the example here, I think, is very interesting, right? So you're working with a postdoc who's exploring their options. The interesting thing about this simulation is that it's actually easier for anyone to give advice to someone else than it is to give advice to yourself. If you were to do this simulation on how to help a postdoc explore their career options and not feel overwhelmed, as you're thinking about it objectively for someone else, you will create a structure for yourself that's much easier to think about than when you're just sitting by yourself and thinking about this for yourself. We see this all the time with things like resumes. If you give someone their own resume and say, what do you think? They're like, oh, it's okay. But if you give them someone else's resume and say, what do you think? They're like, well, this can be changed and this, because it's sort of easier to get out of your head and give that advice. So again, this would be the simulation in this context, just an interesting one, but an example of what we do day in and day out in our roles here at Career Services, working with students and postdocs. So then here's the self-reflection, right? So if you do the exercise, you then get to step out of that experience and say, well, what does this mean to me? What did I take from this? What did I like? What didn't I like? Did it resonate with me? Did I find it enjoyable? Because if you didn't like any aspect of it, none of it sort of resonated with you, that's information to know. If you're like, well, this is interesting, or I could see myself doing that, that's additional information to know as well. So again, this is just an example of the self-reflection that you're going to go through. Then what they're sort of suggesting for you is that once you've done the exercise, you now have something that you can talk to experts in the field about, more so than just saying, hey, tell me more about your role, is that you can find someone who does something similar and you can say to them, I completed this exercise on creating a fact sheet in policy. Is that the type of thing that you do? Or when you do that, what does that look like for you? And what it does is a couple of things. It gives you the ability to ask more involved questions, but it also gives the person that you're talking to an idea that you have invested time into this process of exploration already. You're not just coming up to them and saying, so what's the world of policy? You're saying, this is what I've done, this is what I've experienced, this is the questions that I have from that. What does that look like from your perspective? And so it involves them much more specifically in the conversation so that they know that they can be helpful because you've already done some of the hard work. So having done these exercises, you can then see, is that a reflection of what it actually is like in the role that this person is in, or how much of their time do they spend doing that? And that gives you more information and more things that you can talk about as part of those conversations. Now, they talk about some of the ways that these conversations can go in terms of having these, what we might call informational interviews with people. So this is just an example of how this platform suggests to structure the conversations. General questions first about their expertise, making sure that you're giving enough information about you, and then discussing, in this case, the simulation itself or what that looks like. So you always have to negotiate for the time with someone. You might reach out to them and say, hey, I also did this simulation. Is this something that we could, I could ask you about? I'd love to get your thoughts on it. So that's a sort of a nice way of just making sure that the expectations in the conversations are met and that they know what's coming. But anytime that you're structuring a conversation with a contact, an alum, someone in your network, anytime that you have some thought ahead of time as to what you want to get out of it, it's going to be a more productive conversation as a whole. Now, how you find people to have these conversations with beyond just those videos that we've already talked about in the broader network, the Penn network, the extended Penn network that postdocs live in, or your own personal networks or professional networks. We won't cover that today because there won't be time, but here's a nice video on our Career Services YouTube channel about how you can network effectively at all points of your PhD and postdoc, leveraging these platforms that are out there. So that's certainly something that you can take a look at as you're thinking about what that networking looks like for you and how that takes you to the next level when it comes to career exploration. Because all the online research that you do is fantastic. You will get all of your questions answered, though, in conversations with people, right? So it will save you eventually a lot of time once you've done the hard work and the foundational research to have those conversations and learn from the people who have gone through the process before. They have best practices of what they did to get to where they are. They have mistakes that they made that they would advise you not to make the same mistakes, right? And learning that means that you'll sort of save yourself a lot of time as part of that process.